room smelled of oil and wet pallets. Jasper produced sealing wax and negatives, little stamps he had burned on a metal plate. He worked with a craft that pleased Matthias, quick eyes, steady hands, a precision of execution that was almost a prayer. "We will make 2 sets, Jasper said. 1 set for market distribution, 1 set for the convent and for soldiers who may be sympathetic. We'll make decoys as well. They will burn the decoys and the populace will see smoke and think the state has done its duty. Meanwhile, the true copies will be out beyond their reach." Matthias folded his hands and began to copy. He copied every ledger line he had, names, dates, little sums that made a life into an account. He wrote the names as if calling them back to the room where he worked, as if on the page their voices might be heard. Ink bled into his skin. The letters he formed were small, exact, and the solace of doing such work steadied him. He thought of the graves Ryan had shown him, the lumps of earth, the stones with no inscription. He thought of his mother's stories about how their family had kept their heads after the rebellion, and he felt that old story crumble into chalk dust. They worked into the night. Outside, a bell tolled with a relentlessness that had become the city's pulse. Someone shouted twice in the distance an arrest, perhaps. Or a market dispute turned violent, or men drunk on power with torches in hand. They were mindful, anxious of the city as living skin. Sound traveled. Rumor was a current, and rumor could drown the quiet truth they carried. The first sign of immediate danger came as a knocked message. Thomas arrived, smudged and breathless, with a new terror in his face. "They've started searching the market stalls now," he said. "They ask for names of buyers." Myra's stall was upturned. "They found nothing there. She hid what she could in sacks of grain, but they'll be back. A wagon, 2 wagons have been taken to Varen's warehouses. Your name was on a ledger of interest, not yours personally, but the line items had references. They will trace handwriting. They will trace paper." Paper could be traced, as Jasper had once explained with a hardened shrug. Watermarks, press impressions, ink composition, everything had a signature. Matthias felt stunned. He had believed that the act of copying, of scattering littler, fragile truths across honest hands, might keep the ledger alive. Now he saw the sophistication of the state's instruments, trained paper makers, forensic clerks, men who could tell the riverbend of a rag pulp. He thought of the small pouches he had sewn into the hems of his shirts in case of emergency, a silly, childish waiting for war habit that had once felt like an insult to his profession. He pulled one free and felt the folded page inside, a list of names in his own shaky hand. He considered burning it, and then, with a kind of stubbornness, he smoothed it and tucked it closer to his chest. "We will not stop," Edda said, when they convened. Her voice was small but unwavering. "If they take the convent, the copies we have in market hands will be all that remains. If they seize the presses, there are hands in the guards who read differently. We must find them." Matthias thought of Captain Ryan and his soldiers' principle. He thought of Mara's zeal on the streets. They needed men who could move in uniforms and carry authority without the Chancellor's paperwork. Men who could say later that they happened upon a box of papers and decided to read them aloud. It was a hazard and active deception that might slide into 1,000 violent justifications, but war had taught the city that some moral operations were messy. As the night deepened on a desultory bench near a shuttered tea-house, Jasper's hands trembled more than his words. "I can make a convincing fake," he admitted, "but I cannot guarantee every hand who touches the truth will behave well. I have kept secrets for coin. I have also kept them because someone asked me to. This city runs on trade, Matt. Not all trade is honorable. People sell safety for a scrap of bread." Matthias wanted to say that he too had traded safety once. The story his mother told and the bargains his family made had been a currency that kept them alive. He wanted to tell Jasper that truth was not only about exposing villains, but about unmaking the economy of fear that fed on silence. But instead he gathered his papers and kept copying. the very act of scribing feeling like a fragile sacrament. Around them the city breathed and coughed. Fires that were not the scriptoriums licked at the horizon, as if the whole town might be under some purgatory. The sound of a cart approaching made them look up. Then relief, it was a moonlit ferry returning from the south, a figure with a lantern crossing the quay. They had no illusions about victory. They had only a stubborn, human refusal to let names be wholly extinguished. At last, in a corner of the room, with wax and cord and a small press that smelled of linseed oil, they bound a small dozen copies. They made them neat, made them portable, embroidered not with the Chronicle's emblem, but with marginal notes only those who cared would understand. Each copy carried an annotation, where the ledger had come from, who had acted to secure it, and a line that read, simply, "Do not forget." Jasper sealed one with a stamp that was clever imitation, his best forgery, and they planted it later among the decoys. It was a small, obscene act, lie to keep the truth alive. But as Matthias tied the thread, he felt the ledger's weight alter from accusation to something almost like warmth. They dispersed under a sky that had hardened into a watchful black. Thomas ran, the bundles safe beneath his cloak. Edda took the chest and moved toward the convent's lane with Sister Anwen waiting in shadow. Matthias lingered a moment, looking back toward the scriptorium's window. In the courtyard, men still hauled crates and set torches. The smell of smoke clung to the buildings like a memory. He knew they had not done enough. The state's appetite was not for one ledger. It was for the principle of control. For every copy they saved, there would be other fires. For every name they preserved, there would be ways to discredit it. But he also knew that the act of writing the names, of folding them into people's hands, had changed him. The ledger was no longer his alone. It had slipped like a stone into the river's current. When he reached his door that night, his mother was waiting in the dim, knitting as if normality could be coaxed back into shape. She made a small, baffled smile and said, "You look like a man who has seen too much paper burned." Matthias wanted to tell her everything and nothing. He wanted to confess the ledger's truth, and the way he had carried it, and the way he had moved it into the city like a contraband. He held his tongue and kissed her forehead. Her skin had the scent of starch and chamomile. The ordinary intimacy of the gesture steadied him. Outside, the city kept grinding toward a morning that promised more of the same. The Chancellor's men had set a rhythm. It would take more than one night's resistance to change it. And yet there was a list now, and it moved like a slow, inexorable animal through people's hands. That thought steadied Matthias more than anything else. He had acted, he had risked household and reputation. The ledger had escaped one inferno. At the far end of the quay, a torch flame birthed a column of smoke that climbed like a judgment to the malevolent stars. And somewhere in the city, someone began to speak a name aloud. Matthias did not know which name it was. He only knew the sound of it was a kind of healing, small, halting, and dangerous. Behind him, on the table in the scriptorium, one of the decoy folios smoldered to nothing. It made a sound like flesh reforming itself, a final exhale that the state would take as victory. Matthias walked past it like a man who had survived a trial and would have to return in the morning to watch the next stage of the war. He had no illusions. Varen would not relent, and the purges would become more precise, more vicious. They had bought time, but not peace. The chapter closed with a thought that had become his companion through the day. Truth might be loud, or it might be small. It could be shouted in squares or kept in margins. The ledger had been forced into margins to survive. Tomorrow it might be read aloud in a tavern, or bared in a soldier's hand. For now it lay in pockets and prayer books, and the memory of people who had taken risks to keep names alive. As he settled to sleep, with the candle guttering like a tired eye, Matthias felt the peculiar clarity of someone who had crossed a threshold. He had chosen action over concealment, and the cost of that choice had already begun to show itself in the city's undercurrents. He told himself that whatever came next, whether arrests, betrayals, or a sudden, terrible reconciliation, he had done the only thing he had been able to do. He had made a record that the state could not wholly consume. A distant bell told midnight. It sounded like a book being closed. The sound carried with it the city's sleep and its thin, dangerous hopes. And for the first time since he had opened the misfiled ledger, Matthias allowed himself to imagine the names not as ragged accusations, but as a chorus, small, human voices that might yet be heard beyond the edicts and the fires. He slept when sleep came, with the ledger's small copies hidden beneath his straw mattress, and with a mind full of plans for the next day. The window for action had not yet slammed shut. It had, for the moment, only been narrowed. There would be more purges to come. There would be searches and lies, and the Chancellor's men with their clean handwriting. But a thing that is written, he thought as darkness folded him, can sometimes outlive those who try to burn it. And so he kept his watch and dreamed of ink. The city had been rehearsing the lie for 2 days. It unfolded with the ritual patience of a prayer practiced, until the hands forget the heart that first offered it. Torches were staggered along the avenue like a measured heartbeat. Boys and girls practiced the smiles that the day demanded, the careful tilt of a head when the Empress was named, the exact angles of hands that would hold the chronicle aloft. The rebuilt capital wore its patched stones as a soldier wears bandage, both repair and evidence. Matthias watched from the shadowed window of the scriptorium and felt the movement as a pressure against his ribs. He was conscious of detail in a way that now felt like both blessing and curse, the sheen on a practicing marshal's boot, the quiver of a tassel on a pageant standard, the taste of ink in his mouth as he licked the end of a quill. Every rehearsal was a rehearsal for communal belief. The city's ritual would not merely affirm the chronicle. It would set the past into public scaffolding. The chronicle would become not a book, but a thing that structured ordinary days, lit by the torches of the avenue and confirmed by the Chancellor's voice. If the chronicle was clean, clean would be true. If clean were a lie, the lie would thicken into law. He had thought for weeks that he might keep the ledger like a burr in his palm, unnoticed, secret, a private atonement. But the ledger refused privacy. It had the stubbornness of a wet ember. The names on its pages would not stop smoldering beneath the official ash. He had lain awake thumbing the ledger's thin spine, as if the sound might answer him. Tonight was the eve of the sanctification. Tomorrow the Empress would pass beneath the arch and the Chancellor would speak as though calamity had been settled. He had to find a way to move what he had found into the place where ritual could not swallow it whole. The scriptorium smelled of dry parchment and lamp oil, of dust that held 1,000 hands' histories. Wax dripped in slow moons down the candelabra. The light made the pooled ink glow like small, black lakes. Galen had lectured that the keeping of books was a prayer against chaos, that the scriptorium turned memory into instrument, and so healed the world by shaping it. Matthias loved Galen for the old man's steadiness and resented him for the words that now fit too easily into the Chancellor's logic. Galen was a man who measured the world by the strength of his bindings. Matthias measured it by the names that no binding should deny. Edda came in as dusk settled, the scriptorium door closing with a muffled sound like a hand sliding across a table. She moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to mask a turbulent river. "They finish rehearsals at the palace at dusk," she said without preface, as if that were a part of the evening's furniture of fact. Varron tests the intonation of his denunciations until they land like stones. She took a seat opposite him, and for a while the two of them made no sound but the scratch of nib on paper. Edda copied an oath from a convent folio, whose script matched the ledger's phrasing, and she did it not with the haste of transcription, but with the attention of ritual. Sister Anwin, who had arranged to be nearby that night under the pretense of cataloguing, came between them with a small bundle of folded pages and the quiet of someone used to speaking in things folded away. "We have to think of the means," Sister Unwin said, placing the bundle on the table as one places a sacrament. She did not speak loudly, but there was force in the simplicity of her voice. "Not every truth survives exposure. Some truths die badly. We must make the facts more difficult to remove than the desire to remove them." Matthias swallowed, and the throat that moved swallowed also the ledger's weight. His fingers traced a name he had come to know more intimately than his mother's. He thought of how his mother hummed lullabies that were also apologies, how the family story had been folded and ironed until it gave the right degree of crease. The ledger unmade that crease with every line he read. "There is time tonight," Edda said. She sounded so firm that he almost believed it could be true. "We can prepare copies, authenticated in some ways and only outwardly contemptible in others. We can seed them where they cannot all be burned at once." Matthias' hands trembled as he lifted his pen. The candlelight made him look older than he felt. For a long while his pen moved with the rhythm of the heart, slow, exact. The patient notarizations of a man who had been trained to kill curiosities by making them legible. He understood now that making the ledger legible in other hands might be the only way to make it safe. An unacknowledged truth could be smothered under official flames, but something copied into various hands might survive the ordered purge by becoming a fact of many small private libraries. They worked in silence until the scriptorium became almost unpeopled. Thomas came late with his courier's breath, damp from the rain outside, and a scrap of parchment bearing the Chancellor's seal in order to increase guard watch near the palace and to authorize searches of buildings where seditious contraband might be found. The paper moved on the table like a small animal that would not be bound. Ryan took it, his gloved thumb flattening the medallion of the seal. "They move faster than we thought," he said. "Probably because of Mara's failed stir. They will look for print shops, for pamphlets. They will look for noise." The soldier's voice folded itself with the careful economy of someone who had practiced speaking under command. Matthias felt the room close. If the Chancellor's agents began to crisscross the city more aggressively, their window to place anything within the official copy of the Chronicle would be narrowed. They had thought in weeks. They now had hours. "We must be precise," Ryan added. "If they come, we scatter. If they do not, we have the one chance tomorrow. We can't risk their burning everything. We must make it so the evidence cannot be wholly destroyed." The plan that followed was both simple and complicated like all desperate things. They would insert a marginal appendix into the official copy, a slip of paper bound into the outer gutter of the Chronicle that would, if chances held, escape the Chancellor's first sweep. That slip would carry the ledger's names, an oath's corroboration, and a short contextual note that made clear the ledger's provenance. They would then seed authenticated copies to Sister Unwin's convent, to discreet hands among the merchants who might find profit in possessing inconvenient knowledge, and to Captain Ryan's pockets for safe keeping. If a single copy escaped purge and found its way into networks, the story would not be wholly extinguished. Matthias' thought returned, with a harder knot, to his family. He had been offered, some days before, a reprieve in exchange for a signed redaction. It had been phrased as a clerical correction, an errant entry that should rightfully be amended. The offer had come with promises of promotion and safety. His mother had laughed nervously when he mentioned it, as if it were a small mercy. The ledger had made that offer a mockery. He had been given the choice between a thicker blanket over the truth and the thin, sharp wind of confession. He could not imagine waking his mother to explain the plan. She had been careful her whole life, a woman who ironed the collars of other people's lives and kept her own heart folded. The scriptorium had been the family's redemption. He had been taught to believe that the Chronicle was a thing that conferred security, not merely stories. To place a marginal appendix was to put that security at risk. It was to trade a roof for an open wound. He felt guilty, as if his hands had committed the betrayal himself. "If it goes badly," Edda said, when the hour had moved into the far slope of night, and the city clock had long fallen silent, "we will lose names and we may lose people. If it goes well, we will save them from being wholly erased. That is a difference worth the wait." Sister Anwen's hands folded, smoothing the vellum like a woman who had smoothed linens for a houseful of grief. "There is another thing," she said. "If a lie is given a margin, people may read the margin. People are not easily made to hold their tongues when they read another name beside the chronicles. Memory is contagious." The plan required that they print copies that looked at first glance insignificant. A small fold bound into the gutter. The handwriting and ink carefully matched to the scriptorium's norms so that a cursory inspection would miss it. They would craft a thin tamper-proof, a 2-inch strip, sewn into the back of the chronicle's final quire. It would be as if a page had turned and the reader found a paler face of history peeking from the margin. It was cunning in its smallness. The trick of surviving depended on being overlooked amidst the larger, louder apparatus of ceremony. Matthias labored into the night. Ryan, when he was not watching the streets, sat on a bench with his head against the wall, eyes closed as if storing images like food. Edda and Sister Anwen moved like quiet sisters of labor, folding, copying, aligning. Thomas came once more with a rumor a watchman had been seen near the scriptorium asking precise questions about the staff's comings and goings. That sound reached Matthias as a small iron on his chest. Gallen's absence was a note of quiet that struck him. The scriptorium master had been summoned to the palace in the afternoon and had not returned. What had been a cavernous room of books now felt like a casket where they were dutifully arranging the possibility of truth. His hand began to cramp from copying. He wrote with the ritual slowness of someone doing penance, each name an act of confession, each corroboration a candle dropped into the dark. Edda produced a small bit of white thread and whispered that she had struck a bargain with a binder's apprentice who owed a favor. The boy would take the appendix into the outer record of the chronicle between midnight and dawn, when the scriptorium watched would be thin. The thought of how precarious that favor was made his stomach roil. Favors could be bought, sold, or turned by a purse heavy enough. He had not considered the texture of his guilt properly until then. It settled like a fine ash over every action. In the quiet, guilt was a variable, changing like weather. It made him meticulous, then cowardly. It made him kind, then cold. He understood that tonight's work would be the measure of who he would be afterward. He might be the son who had preserved his family's roof, or he might be the man who set in motion a different kind of reckoning. Outside, a bell tolled one slow, solemn knell. He did not know whether it called to prayer, to the sand of watch hours, or to the city's own nerves. The scriptorium felt like a boat bending to a wind that might snap the mast at any minute. When the last strip of paper was inked and folded, when the last corroborating note was attached with the care of a doctor sewing an artery, they paused. Matthias held the tiny thing between finger and thumb and saw in it the ledger's full weight. It was small and terrible. "Do you understand?" he asked, though he knew they all did. There was a clearness in their faces at that moment that had not been there at the start, the clarity of people who choose. Captain Ryan stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the avenue where torches threw pretense into gold. He saw, perhaps, how fragile a public's belief might be if even an elbow were revealed. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will be where the chronicle is kept before the procession. I will watch the pageant as if it were a thing of beauty. But my hands will be ready for other work." Matthias envied that certainty. It was a soldier's comfort to have a simple plan and a time. His own plan was a ledger of small acts, scattered like breadcrumbs, and hope that someone's greed or superstition would not see them all eaten. Still, when they set their little bundle into the clandestine box devised by Sister Anwen, lined with soft cloth and hidden in a place Under the floor, where the rat tracks crossed, they felt. For a second, like people who had delivered a mercy. The night did not end in calm. At the last moment, a soft but urgent knock sounded at the scriptorium's outer door. Thomas opened it to a damp-faced man whose cloak bore the Chancellor's colors. A soldier of the watch, out of rotation and with urgent eyes, stood with a small warrant pinned to a chest like a metal flower. "Orders from the palace," he said, voice efficient, "to do cursory inspections of public offices tonight, and to report any anomalies tied to sedition." The warrant was general: search for seditious libels, unauthorized pamphlets, and other contraband. The paper's words were not accusatory in their sound, but they carried the exactitude that had become the government's habit. The soldier peered in, and his gaze brushed over the benches, over the stacks of unbound paper, over their faces. He stopped long on Matthias, and gave him the look men give one another when they consider the ease of compliance. Matthias felt the current of his breath tighten. He had expected the chance of entry. He had not expected it tonight. Edda paled, though her face was a mask that did not show the strain. Unwin's fingers tightened on the cloth that covered their bundle. "We are cataloguing," Galen's substitute explained when he had been fetched back from the dark corner. Galen's voice came like an old bell, though the man himself was not there in person. Public records duty. Nothing of concern. The soldier's gaze shifted, and for a moment it was a thing dangerous in its casualness. He moved through the room with the efficiency of routine. He lifted a folio here, turned a page there, and his fingers left an odd, cold trace on the vellum. If he had asked to see locked shelves, they might have been required to submit. He did not ask. He left with the warrant's polite salutation and a face that measured what it would cost to press. When the door had closed, the sound in the scriptorium was like the draining of a pool. "We must be faster," Edda whispered. "Now the time for insertion is in hours, not days." Matthias' hands were steady when he took the tiny bundle and set it upon the working table. He had prepared himself in small moral increments to this moment. But the reality of moving something that would alter the spine of the state's official book made him feel as if his head had been hollowed out. He had made 1,000 neat redactions in ink for the Chronicle's editors. He had never before made a single edition designed to be found. They worked until the candles burned low and the wax pools cooled, then tied their bundle in cloth and placed it in the hollow beneath the floor where rat tracks made faint, dark crosses. Each of them said something small and practical: a list of names, a place to meet if the scriptorium was searched, and then dispersed into the night like people with contraband 1 heartbeat away from discovery. Matthias lingered. He climbed the stair to the small room that housed his few possessions, and his hands moved with a habit that steadied him. He smoothed his mother's apron that lay folded, the hem carrying a month's small hole. He touched the place where his father's hand had once held his shoulder in a manner that was more apology than embrace. He thought of the ledger again, of the fold in which he had found it, and of the ledger's small insistence on naming. As he drew his blanket about his shoulders, a sound came, a soft, urgent knock that was not the one that had come earlier. This one was close and certain. He rose with the speed of someone suddenly awake, and moved to the window where the avenue showed only a wash of torchlight and the silhouette of a passing cart. The knock was repeated, more insistent, and he knew before he opened the door who it would be. Captain Ryan stood on the threshold, his breathing measured and his coat wet with rain. He handed Matthias a small, folded scrap. "They have changed the procession route," he said. "The Chancellor is nervous. They will want to secure the Chronicle earlier than planned. If we wait until the usual hour, we will be too late." Matthias felt the room tilt. The city had given them what thin time it had, and then it drew it back like a curtain. There were, in a single breath, fewer hours, fewer passes, fewer chances to bind their small appendix into the official book. The guilt that had been his companion tightened into a thing that had to be acted upon, or else would calcify into a stone. "Then we move tonight," he said, and the words left him with a sound like a door clicking shut. They had thought to act at dawn. They now had to choose